Hello scale model lovers. Yes, I'm done. But this one wasn't easy. I almost quit. I messed up the decals, ruined the base coat, and parts kept breaking off. My patience was tested more than once. Still, I learned some new techniques and even made a few fancy modeling tools along the way. And, as usual, I applied too much of everything. Typical. So let's get this over with and dive right in. I started by applying the decals, which meant I needed to gloss coat the surface first. But since I was lazy, I only sprayed the spots where the decals would go. Little did I know this decision would open the gates to a whole new world of pain. But more on that later. And because I was in a hurry, I missed a section on the back and added a lofty fingerprint on the front. Off to a great start already. Moving on. I bought myself this fancy Penninghouse decal sheet, since the Arietta insignia looked like it had been printed during a coffee break. I also decided that it would be a good idea to paint the white recognition disc instead of using a decal. But that was the exact moment things started going south. My only circular cutter was this prehistoric compass cutter. And of course, the masking tape I had was way too thick. A perfect setup for failure. Attempt after attempt, the counter just kept climbing. I spilled meters of tape, ruined my cutting mat, and watched my patience evaporate. Eventually though, I got the hang of it and managed to cut some decent masks. By the end, the only thing perfectly round was my bruised ego. I quickly slapped the mask on the turret and, for reasons still unknown to this day, started with the decals first. It made sense at the time, trust me. Applying the decals didn't go as planned either. They had really thick backing paper, so I had to use scissors to cut them out. The first one fell off the paper immediately, and of course it was also the wrong side. At this point I genuinely questioned how I graduated from high school. The second decal refused to come off at all, so I had to use my greasy fingers, and it still ended up misaligned. So much for a clean application. I got so stressed I even turned off the camera since actual tactical surgery was required. But somehow, eventually, I managed to get them on. I then quickly painted the recognition disc in matte white, peeled off the masking tape and found myself staring at a perfect half circle. I was very happy. We're not even 5 minutes in and already everything is descending into chaos. Time for a bit of relaxed airbrushing. Before I could get to the fun part of weathering, I had to varnish the whole model. I hate this step. It's hard to see what you're doing, everything dries clear, and you have to hit the entire model evenly. The upside, however, is that you get to admire how good the decals look without silvering. That's nice. This time I was extra careful not to leave any fingerprints or cause any unnecessary damage. I still don't have a proper holder for handling the model during painting, so once again I used my very tactical sponge. The jerry cans also needed a coat of satin, since they'll get the same weathering treatment as the vehicle. And then came the real horror. The lower hull and underside of the vehicle. This is when I realized mounting the suspension in the last episode was a terrible idea. Getting to every spot with varnish and later with weathering is basically a nightmare. Planning is clearly not my strong suit, at least not with modeling. I even wrote out a little checklist on paper so I wouldn't miss any spots. Such a noob. I should probably rename this channel to something like Real Amateur. Anyway, bonus tip. If you're impatient like me, you can blow air from your airbrush to speed up drying time. Bonus tip 2. Don't mount the suspension before varnishing. After wasting a good chunk of varnish just to make sure everything was covered, it was finally time for the fun part of this hobby. Or was it? For this build I started with a raw umber pin wash. The pin wash gives more control, needs less cleanup and still subtly tints the surface, almost like a gentle filter. I don't really measure the ratio, just experiment a little and adjust depending on the effect you want. Oil washes are also very forgiving. If you apply too much, just clean your brush and soak up the excess. You can also lightly dampen the brush with thinner and guide the wash into all the details. Be really gentle on the thinner though, otherwise you will just remove the entire wash. If you do, you can always go back and add some more. It's all up to you, really. Bonus tip. If you are as clumsy as me, it is a good idea to secure your painting palette with double-sided sticky tape, since we don't want odorless thinner flying across the bench. I also found this in my girlfriend's makeup bag. I don't know what they use it for, but I found it works perfectly for cleaning up excess wash. As it turns out, the whole makeup department is a gold mine for modelers, and cheaper too if you catch my drift. Anyway, I noticed things were going suspiciously well, which is never a good sign. And if you know, and you can already see what's going on. The wash bleeded all over the surrounding surface instead of around the details. The turret was fine, so what was going on? Then it hit me. I had messed up the base coat. Some of the larger areas had a rough texture, almost like sandpaper, probably due to spraying from too far away, letting the paint dry mid-air before landing on the model. I didn't notice it at first, since you can't see it with the naked eye, but it definitely felt really coarse, and therefore ruined the behavior of the oil wash. At this point, I was ready to give up on this whole project. How many setbacks can a man take? I honestly didn't know how to proceed. A few thoughts crossed my mind, but let's not go there. Since I apparently have no life beyond skill modeling, I had no choice but to push forward. I started by sanding the fenders with a 4000 grit sanding stick to prep them for the gloss varnish. Then I wrapped this boyo up and went to work. And yes, it happened again. I don't want to talk about it. The sanding created a bit of white residue from the previous satin coat, so I quickly did some touch-ups with a highly diluted version of the base coat. After that was dry, I immediately gloss coated all the affected areas, and because I like to live dangerously, I sprayed the satin coat with only 10 minutes in between. The manufacturer recommends waiting at least 2 hours. So yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Since the varnish had to dry for a couple of days, I figured it was a good time to focus on the stowage. And pray I hadn't ruined anything with the varnish. Since I never paid much attention during art class, most of the stowage ended up with unwanted dents and imperfections. I quickly filled them with some putty and sanded everything smooth. I also added these cute little straps made from Tamiya tape and glued them in place with CA glue. Neat, huh? At least now they don't look like toilet paper anymore. The sandbags got some sanding love as well. After that, I gave all the stowage a coat of acrylic black primer and moved on to the sandbags. And yes, they're grey now. I tried giving them a zenithal highlight, not sure if that was worth the effort. Disclaimer: do not use my workflow or order of operations as a tutorial. At this stage, it is all about experimenting and finding my own approach to painting details like these. Anyway, I mixed different shades of buff and tried to paint each sandbag in a slightly different tone to keep the surface more random. The paint was quite thin, letting some of the primer show through, which added to the overall texture. Lastly, I gave them a glaze of the base color to tie everything together. But man, these things look like they just rolled out of a 135 bakery. You have to forgive me. First tank, first stowage, first sandbags. But let's move on to the tarps. The tarps received a khaki earth tone, which turned out to be a good choice. The crate got a special treatment. I started with a very light sand-based color and then painted all the wood grains using different wood tones, starting with the darkest and working up to the lightest tone. The trick is to make sure your paint is properly diluted and to use something like a size 1 brush. Let the brush do all the work. You should barely apply any pressure during this technique. After applying some chipping fluid, I sprayed a dark olive drab on top. Once that was dry, I began removing the paint using a variety of tools. Unfortunately, in some areas the chips were way too big and large chunks came off. The paint also felt quite rubbery, and if you look closely, there were also air bubbles on the surface. In hindsight, I probably applied too much chipping fluid and should have let the paint dry much longer. There's no time to redo anything. I need to move on and finish this model. The stowage will get some love later with oil washes and feathering. For now, it is time to see if the model survived the varnish apocalypse, and if it has, finally get back to that pin wash. I didn't know what to expect, but as it turned out, I had been incredibly lucky. Nothing bad had happened. And even better, the wash now flowed beautifully around all the details. All the hard work actually paid off. I was in a really good mood. So now I could finally finish adding the pin washes to the hull and lower sides of the model. And although some parts will be covered with stowage, I started with the engine deck since it was a good place to begin and catch any flaws in the satin coat. But this time everything went smoothly. Finally, something went right. I also did the front plate. But here you might ask, what about the sandbags? Well, let's just say I have a little surprise planned for this part of the model, but more on that later. After everything had time to dry, I started cleaning up the excess with a brush damped with odorless thinner. I deliberately waited a bit longer before cleaning so I could start feathering out the edges and in the process tint the surrounding surface, which I think gives a nice overall effect. After that I focused on the lower hull and the suspension of the vehicle. There was a lot of nice detail to work with here, which made the process really enjoyable. I deliberately applied the wash much heavier on this part of the model, since it's much dirtier and casts stronger shadows. I also gave the leaf springs a darker color, I'm not sure if that was a good idea, but I might change it later or add some pigments to make it look less sterile. After cleaning up all the excess wash, it was time to let everything dry for a couple of days and brace myself for even more oil painting. Some oil paints were prepared on a cardboard pallet and I was ready to get to work. I started by placing tiny dots of oil paint on the surface. I used white very sparingly on the spots where the highlights would be most pronounced. For the rest of the surface, I added buff and raw umber for the shadows. Since oil paints give you a long working time, I could map everything out using all those tiny dots, from lightest to darkest. At this point, the model was starting to look like a badly decorated Christmas tree. Of course, as the process went on, I got way too confident and applied too much oil paint. But with a bit of odorless thinner, this was easily removed. I tried blending everything in the most logical way, following the direction of the light and working around details and panels. A good idea is to thin the paint slightly beforehand, it makes blending much easier. Once the odorless thinner had dried, I went over the surface with a completely dry brush to smooth everything out. In this case a filbert brush, which has a nice rounded tip. On the sides of the turret, I added some shadows underneath and introduced a few streaking effects using the same colors. I used a completely wrong brush for this, and it shows. The streaks were all over the place. Ah well, we all have to start somewhere, I guess. Although very subtle, especially on camera, you can see the difference here. This is where I had just finished the left side of the model. I was completely in shock. It had turned out exactly how I wanted. Probably the first time during this whole build. Maybe someday I might even get the hang of this hobby. Great, we can move on to the next step, which is chipping. And for those of you who saw episode 2 of this build, well, let's just say I wasn't looking forward to this. To make sure I wouldn't ruin the model right away, I safely started with the jerry cans. Probably not very realistic to chip them this heavily, but I had a hard time figuring out how to make them look in scale instead of like toys. Chipping seemed to be the best solution at the time. I mainly focused on the outer edges and handles, trying not to overdo it. In hindsight, the color is probably not very realistic. Oh well, at least they tie in nicely with the rest of the model. This is the final result. Off to a good start, they look decent enough. Maybe I could have base coated them in a lighter color and made sure each one was slightly different, but that's something for future builds. And yes, I'm sorry. I'm just a big man child when it comes to these kind of things. Anyway, back to the model. I was still traumatized by the interior fill, so I really dreaded this part of the painting. Because of that, I started very slowly. I also made sure the sponge I used didn't have any rough edges, and I used paint straight from the bottle without thinning it. Because that was exactly where I messed up last time. Back then I thinned the paint, which made the chipping blobs way too big and round, but that's a thing of the past now. Here you can see how dry the paint actually is. And with chipping especially, less is more. You can always add more. Removing it though, well, let's not go there. I wanted to keep the chipping light and focus only on areas that would be handled by the crew or prone to damage. I also did a light pass on the undersides of the fenders. I thought it would help outline them a bit more, giving them a less toy-like and more in scale look. Definitely a lot of lessons learned here. Even if you really dread something, you should face it and get over with it. Most of the time it's all in your head. By spending more hours at the bench and getting more practice, you build confidence. And that's a good thing. With that little confidence boost, it was time to paint all the vehicle details. Let's do this. I began by painting everything in the respective base coats. The machine gun got a coat of dark grey and the sling was painted olive drab. The tools on the engine deck were probably painted in the vehicle's base color, but for the sake of skill modeling, let's just do what everybody else is doing these days. The handles received a very light wood tan, and all the metal parts got different shades of grey. Some of the tools also received a light grey glaze to depict wear and tear. I tried filming and painting the periscope at the same time, but that turned into mission impossible. Still, this is the result, and I also painted the headlights and tail lights silver. Next I started applying oil washes to everything. The gun received a pure black wash. The wood tones got a raw umber wash and some rust tones were added to the metal parts. After that I rubbed all the metal parts with metallic pigment using this silicone thingy, whatever it's called. I finished the parts with a small graphite pencil. At that point I could finally remove the masking tape. And to be honest, I had been postponing the tarps and sandbags. I wanted to paint them using acrylics, but that was way out of my comfort zone. So I chickened out and gave everything a raw umber wash, followed by a quick good old dry brush with the base color. And then there were these things. I really didn't want to give these ugly buggers a wash, because that would only amplify my poor sculpting skills. But since painting with acrylics was also beyond my pay grade, what to do? I settled on oils and went for a quick and dirty technique, brushing raw umber into the shadows and blending it out. And you know what? The results were better than expected. Pro level? Absolutely not, but definitely better than a paint wash. Only one more thing to tackle: the headlights. They received a filter of Tamiya smoke to tone down the silver and add some shine. And to finish it all off, I completely drowned them in wet effects. The makeup sponge saved the day yet again, and luckily I was able to remove the spilled wet effects. Now for the tracks. I quickly cleaned them with some IPA and started priming everything in black acrylics. So why didn't I use blackening fluid, I hear you say? Well, for one, I didn't have any, and two, it's extremely messy. And I really hate messy. I know, I didn't pick the right hobby. Anyway, I quickly discovered a better way to spray paint 135 tracks. I constructed this high-end track painting jig out of a kitchen towel holder taped sideways. MacGyver would be proud. The spare tracks and the chain got the same treatment. After a few days of drying, I base coated everything in a very dark brown color. Then I wanted to add some rust tones, using yet again the sponge technique. This time it didn't really work. Since the tracks are so small, I couldn't reach all the crevices and found myself more painting than adding chips. So I finally had an excuse to use my stippling brush. And this turned out to be a success. Who would have thought? With a dabbing motion, I was able to produce an irregular pattern of rust tones. Just make sure most of the paint is removed before you start. And when the brush still has fresh paint, start gently. Otherwise you'll just flood the surface. There was still some use for the sponge, since the sides needed to be done, and of course, I couldn't forget about the chain. This is the final result. What do you guys think? Cool technique or not? After mixing and testing different colors on some leftover tracks, I settled on this dusty earth tone. Unfortunately, I still messed the color up, but we'll get to that in a moment. I applied the liquid more or less randomly, trying to create different patches of dust with a few touch-ups here and there. I then cleaned up the inner track runs with the silicone thingy, followed by some graphite from a good old-fashioned pencil. After that I sanded all the track teeth, exposing the metal of the Fryo model tracks. The things I'm willing to do for this channel. Insane, right? At this point I've spent more quality time with these tracks than with my girlfriend, and honestly, they're way less demanding. But when fitting them onto the model, they felt really out of place. They turned out way too chalky. I completely forgot that pigments shift in color, so I brushed on some darker pigments into the recesses and ended up with this. Now that the tracks are finished, we can finally wrap this up and put the model together. I still wasn't out of the woods. When painting the idlers a steel color, one of them broke off, but that turned out to be a good thing. There was still a little piece of Blu-Tack stuck inside. Go figure. But having all the dust from sanding the attachment point on your freshly painted model, not so cool. But now I could finally glue all the stowage permanently in place. Of course I spilled a drop or two of CA glue here and there and secured everything with this out-of-scale rigging rope. It was the only rope I had, and I really wanted to add something with real texture to the model. It took me a whole night. It's not perfect, but at least it's actual rope. Lastly I fitted the jerry cans, made straps for them and painted them in a greenish stone. I really like using the actual hinges, just as the crew members would have done. It really adds to the model, I think. So we're almost there. Since my reference is a restored museum vehicle, I wanted to keep the weathering on this little Simovente very light. As I touch up these final details, I can't help but think back over the whole build. What worked, what didn't, and what it taught me along the way. And man, this was quite the first build. You see, like many of us, I returned to this hobby after many years and completely underestimated the amount of work a build like this involves. To be completely honest, back in the day I never even got past adding a pin wash to a model. So I had to revisit and learn many new techniques at once. That was quite the challenge, I tell you. Before I even started this project, I was like a kid in a candy store. I wanted stowage, sandbags, metal tracks, scratch build details. I mean, why not? It's in the reference, and how hard can it be, right? Well, I guess I was wrong about that. Next time I'll go easier on the stowage and try to focus on learning one technique at a time. I certainly learned a lot though. I definitely won't be gluing the suspension on before painting next time, and I'll make sure the base coat is smooth from the start. The hardest part was making sure all the elements like stowage, tracks and so on integrated properly with the model, while also looking in scale and less toy-like. I still have a lot to learn in that area. Sometimes it's really hard to see how the finished result will turn out, and that can create a mental block. How do you guys deal with this? With so many techniques involved, it's hard to imagine the final result and know whether you're doing the right things. I think that's the hardest part of skill modeling. Let me know in the comments. So, time to come clean. Remember when I said the interior was never going to be seen? I even added an interior no one will ever see. I decided to keep things simple as well, since much of it wouldn't be visible afterwards anyway. Yeah, well, I lied. Ha, I bet you didn't expect that. As it turns out, even though this kit is from 1975, the molding is so good that you don't actually have to glue the upper structure in place. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but after all that hard work, I thought it would be a cool thing to do. And look at this. Even with the stowage on, it still works perfectly. Very cool, if I may say so myself. And with that, my friends, I think it's time for the end of the build party. I am so sorry about this. I just couldn't resist. So what now that the Semovente series has come to an end? Well, truth be told, I didn't have any plans when I uploaded my first video. I thought, let's upload it just for fun, and if someone somewhere in the world watches and gives it a like, my mission is complete. And if someone were to subscribe, that would be even more awesome. I genuinely expected nothing more, but the next morning, after uploading the first video, 100 people had already watched it and 2 of you subscribed. That was the coolest thing ever. But it didn't end there. So many of you tuned in, commented and helped out with tips and tricks. I genuinely can't thank you enough for this. I am truly grateful for all this support. It really helped me get through my first build and push on with this channel. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. No, really. I probably wouldn't have even finished this kit without you, since there were so many easy opportunities to opt out during the many failures. As for the next project, it's already built, but it will be far less complex. I need a short break before moving on. Like many of you, I have more kits in my stash than I have time to build, so I will probably never run out of projects or ideas. I'm both glad and sad that this project has come to an end. What a journey it's been. But every ending makes room for a new beginning. Wait, the decal has silvering?